Um, we are continuing our study of women in the Bible, and we're going to look tonight at the book of Esther. And I don't know how familiar, some of you probably very familiar with Esther. Maybe most of you are very familiar with Esther. Maybe some not so much. And so, you know, if there's a question you have, something that comes up that you want to talk about, just feel free to shout it out. Let us know, and we'll be glad to address whatever your questions might be. It's an interesting little story. It's kind of unique in Scripture. There's a lot of things very unique about it in Scripture, and so I think as we kind of think about this theme of looking at the lives of women in Scripture, the experiences of women in Scripture, Esther is an obvious choice. She's one of two women in the Bible that have books in the Bible named after her. And so that's pretty significant. And I don't know what your view is of Esther, what you think about Esther. Esther has been over the years, over the centuries, the inclusion of Esther in the Hebrew Bible was even sort of debated for a long time. Should Esther be included at all? Why do you think that is? Why was there debate perhaps about Esther being included, the book being included?
Well, on its surface, it's not very theologically rigorous. I've often heard it bandied that it's the only book of the Bible that doesn't mention God. It's the only book of the Bible that doesn't directly mention God by name. But I mean, come on, he's all through the book.
It is true that, your phrase theologically rigorous is probably a good one. There's not a lot of theology in Esther, though there are other books in the Bible that don't contain a lot of like sort of theoretical theology. Esther does not mention God directly in the Hebrew version. Now there's a Greek version of Esther that you'll see sometimes in if you have a Bible that has the Apocrypha in it, you will see something called probably additions to Esther. And what that reflects is a different version of Esther that we are aware of, a Greek version of Esther that contains some stuff that is not contained in the Hebrew Bible. Principally what it contains is a lot of references to God and two prayers. So a lot of people seem to have said over the years, well, it's a way of sort of making Esther more religious. It bothered somebody that Esther wasn't as religious as they thought it should be, and so they added some stuff about God, some overtly religious stuff. I don't know if that's quite a fair way to look at it, but that's at least one way of looking at the fact that there's this other version of it. But in the verse, God is not referenced directly. And so that has given people problems before. And so Esther has been debated for years. Should it be in the Bible? Another problem that people seem to have with Esther is the whole circumstance. How faithful a Jew would Esther have been, the argument goes, based on the situation that she was in. And so there were those who felt it should be excluded. I don't like this idea of excluding stuff from canon that is uncomfortable to us. I think often the stuff that is the most uncomfortable to us is the stuff we really need to deal with and wrestle with. So Esther, you can turn to Esther chapter 1 if you'd like to. The book is somewhat dated. In Esther chapter 1, verse 1, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. And then verse 3, in the third year of his reign. So that really helps a lot if you know, for instance, who Xerxes was. Xerxes is a Persian king. Some translations will have the name Ahasuerus. That's the difference between Persian versus Greek. He was a ruler of Persia. He was the grandson of Cyrus the Great. son of Darius the First. He ruled Persia from 486 to 425 BC. So we're talking almost 500 years before Jesus was born, was when the events of Esther take place. The Persian Empire, of course, was, just to keep it straight, the Babylonians were the ones that destroyed Jerusalem, took the Jews into exile in 586 BC, something like that. About 70 years later, 75 years later, the Persians conquered the Babylonians. And so the Jews became sort of, their masters became the Persians. And so that's the period of time we're in, when the Persians are sort of the dominant empire in the ancient Near East, and they are the rulers of the Jews. In fact, the Holy Land is still destroyed, pretty much, and still fairly empty, and there are Jews scattered throughout the Persian Empire. And that's where we meet Esther and her relative Mordecai in the city of Susa, the Persian town of Susa.
You said the grandson of Cyrus?
Grandson of Cyrus.
I thought Cyrus was the one that decreed they could go back.
Cyrus the First. Yes, he did decree that some went back. Yes.
And it's far after that, they haven't made that much progress.
Oh, I mean, there were several different returns. You might remember Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel. There were several sort of massive waves going back, and it seemed fits and starts, right? I mean, you have the walls being built in Jerusalem, and then you have some years later the temple being restored, and or maybe it was the other way around. I can't remember. The other way around, I think. Temple first, and then the walls. So yeah, I mean, there were people back in the Promised Land, but it was still very much a recovery happening. Does that make sense? So in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign, he gives this banquet for all his nobles and his officials, and he asked his queen Vashti to come in and display her beauty. Is what the NIV says, verse 11, chapter 1. He sends 7 eunuchs to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing a royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So that's sort of the precipitating event that brings about all of this stuff that we read about in Esther. How does Vashti respond to that? Being called into the king's presence in front of all his buddies to display her beauty.
She says no.
She was not going to go.
Shocking that she just wasn't flattered. I don't understand, right? She's not flattered by this show of attention, right? She's not flattered that her husband wants to show her off, or the king wants to show her off. So she says, "No, thank you. I don't believe I'm going to do that." And the king becomes angry. Talks to some of his nobles, his cabinet, perhaps. What should we do to Queen Vashti? And what do they come up with?
Have a beauty pageant.
Yeah, we're gonna hang that term beauty pageant on a hook just for a second. But yes, we're going to audition new queens, is perhaps a good way to put it. And so. And I love some of Esther is really very sort of darkly humorous, and I love the nobles saying, if word of this gets out, our wives are going to talk back to us too. I mean, isn't this just like, doesn't this ring true that somebody would say this? We can't let this happen because this is going to set a bad precedent in the Persian Empire. Our wives aren't going to do what we say if you let this go unpunished. And so Vashti is excluded. She is loses her. She's never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. and let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. And this edict goes out. Verse 20, then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all this vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. And that's even put into the edict, that every man should be ruler over his own house, according to the edict that's sent out. So we're starting off really with, it's you laugh, but it's an ugly scene to begin with. It's an ugly scene that we start with. That the king thinks of his queen Vashti in this way, that the men of the kingdom, the nobles, are concerned about their own home and how they will be able to control their wives. So immediately we have this at first blush, you get this real sense of what life might have been like for women in this culture, in this time and place. And it's not pretty.
Well, Patrick,
Yes.
also, I mean, this king, my goodness, he gets all angry and does something, and then he has to backtrack and find what can I do now, make some laws. And he keeps doing things like that. He keeps it's like he doesn't have any planning. You know what I mean? So
Isn't it good that we've never had a president or anything?
I mean, he just, yeah. But it's like he doesn't come across to me as having any sense, but he has way too much power. But I mean, what you said about the edict, I mean, it is funny, but it's awful.
It really is ugly. I mean, you laugh because and I think it's intended to be. I think you're intended to laugh at it, at the ridiculousness of it. But it's real people, right? It's people who are affected by this and who are having to now, it's not pretty. And I, fair warning, the rest of Esther doesn't get much pretty as we go here. So that's when we are introduced then in chapter 2 to Mordecai and his relative Esther, cousin is what it says, but the word can be kind of flexible. Hadassah is probably the Hebrew name. Esther seems to be the Persian name. Some people think it comes from Ishtar, the Egyptian goddess that was sort of worshipped all over the ancient Near East. Some think it just means star. Probably debatable. But it was not unusual. Remember, in the Babylonian captivity, Daniel and his friends all had Babylonian names. So it's not unusual. You're trying to make these young Jewish people into good Babylonians, good Persians. It's not unusual to rename it. But as you said, Christy, when his fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what he'd done and what he decreed about it. So, because now he's short a queen, right? So let a search be made, the personal attendants propose, for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king, and there's some administration about how this is going to be done. We're going to bring all these young women from all over the empire into the harem at the Citadel of Susa and placed under the care of the harem keeper who is in charge of the women, the text says. So again, this is not pretty. Dad, you mentioned the beauty contest. I as a kid in Sunday school class, that was sort of how this was all sort of spun, which, I mean, for a Sunday school class, that's good. But I mean, that doesn't quite capture what's happening, right? I mean, I think we know that going, kind of looking at this, it doesn't quite capture what's happening. It doesn't. let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. And this one we meet then Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. He's a Benjamite who's a son of Kish, just like King Saul was a Benjamite who is the son of Kish. We don't know if son means probably descendant here. We don't know if it's a descendant of the same Kish, but the fact that he's got an ancestor named Kish and then he's a Benjamite becomes kind of significant as the story goes on. He was taken into exile, or at least somebody in his family had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So there's some questions about age here, but perhaps it was some of his ancestors who were taken into captivity. But in any case, he's brought up this young woman, Hadassah or Esther, as his own, because she doesn't have a father or mother. And we get that Esther was attractive. So Esther is taken into the palace, into this situation, entrusted to the Haggai who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Does that sound like anything else? She pleased him and won his favor. Well, yeah, I didn't think about Jacob and Rachel, but I was thinking about Daniel. Daniel had sort of a similar circumstance when he was taken into captivity in Babylon. He was sort of taken into perhaps the academy at Babylon or whatever, and intended for the king's service. And you remember he and his friends sort of enjoyed this special favor. And in Daniel, it's explicitly mentioned that it's God who helps to make sure that Daniel is favored by those he comes in contact with, those who are have some influence over him. So in any case, the same thing happens here.
I guess Jacob works. I meant to say Joseph.
Joseph, yes.
Finding favor.
Yes, Joseph, that's true. Joseph finds favor with the Pharaoh and with the Egyptians who he's dealing with. Verse 10, now Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So the next few verses explain what's going to happen to Esther. First of all, she gets 12 months of beauty treatments. That's the way the NIV translates it. And there's half the year with this, half the year with that. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, return to another part of the harem, to the care of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. This is why I said it's more than just a beauty contest, right? She spends the night with the king. That's the way the contest works. That's how it goes. She spends the night with the king, and then she goes to the other house for the concubines. And concubines are what?
Harem, the second backup wives for the king.
I'm sorry?
Backup wives for the king.
Backup wives. Yeah, okay. Concubines are, they're sort of, they don't enjoy the status of full wives exactly. There's no dowry connected with them. There's no political alliance that they bring. The concubine is more like a slave of some sort or a servant of some sort, though the concubine does have, get cared for by the king, gets food from the king, that sort of thing. But not much more than a slave. And so Esther finds herself having a night with the king and then moved into the harem with the concubines. So, comments or anything? I'm talking a little bit. Again, this is not pretty at all. This is not it's not a Hallmark movie week kind of thing. I mean, this is not it's not unusual for the way, I'm sure, the way ancient Near Eastern rulers or 21st century rulers would behave, but it's not pretty, and it's pretty ugly, and you know, I think you have to feel for Esther, right? That this is not like it's not a great privilege. This is a violation. Yeah, Matt.
This part of what God tells Samuel to warn the Israelites about.
Yeah.
The king will just select men, abandon them for his own purposes.
That's right. That's right.
Essentially treat them like objects, which is what's happening here.
I mean, I wasn't going to actually say it out loud because I was thinking it. Talk about a concubine in this. I mean, it's a sex slave, right? It's a sex worker, and that's what we have. That's essentially what's going on. And so,
Well, to call her a worker suggests she had agency and aim.
Right,
She did.
right.
I think slave is a pretty good
Right.
descriptor since
Right.
she chose none of it.
and that's the thing. This is out of her hands. I mean, what you said, Matt, about the king. You know what Samuel warned Israel about. You know, asking for a king. He'll take your sons for workers. He'll take your daughters. I mean, this is what they do. This is what will happen. So this is not what God wanted. This is not what God wanted to see. God doesn't think this is all right. But this is where Esther finds herself. And just imagine, you know, I don't know how observant a Jew she was. We don't really know. In the Greek version of Esther, she's quite observant, but we don't really know from the Hebrew version how observant a Jew she was. But I mean, she's got no, Josh, you said no agency. She's got no control over this. It's out of her hands, and these men are making these decisions for her. And I mean, it's an unpleasant situation. But verse 17, the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women. She won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials, proclaimed a holiday, etc., etc. And we see this repeated a couple of times. Esther doesn't tell anyone she's Jewish. Mordecai has instructed her, don't tell anyone you're Jewish. Why do you think?
They must have a reputation as second-class citizens.
Okay.
They're subjugated people after all. So the eyes of the Persians, they're not going to have status.
I mean, we're going to see, pretty soon, Haman has this response to Mordecai. He goes to the king and says, there's this group of people, they don't do what the rest of us do. They're not like us. They're different from us. So I think it's a way of protecting her. He wants her to be safe, and he doesn't think that she's going to be able to be safe, with knowing she's a Jew.
I know I'm being cynical about this, but there's a part of me that says, if you tell them you're a Jew, then you might not get in this position to begin with, and they might leave you alone, and you don't have to be a concubine. But
maybe
that's a modern approach, I know. But
yeah.
They know, these women know what, even if they win the contest or whatever, what just happened to Queen Vashti? I mean, they have, even if they get the robe, they have more power. It's potentially can go away in a second. So,
Right. That's exactly.
but I mean, there's a part of me that says a good Jew would say, let's not be part of this, but I'm not there to be in her shoes, but I don't know.
Hence the reason people have had problems with the book of Esther. And I think that's one of but I do think that's one of the things we're supposed to kind of wrestle with in this book. Esther doesn't, Esther's kind of the anti-Daniel, right? Daniel, when the king says you can't pray to anybody but me, at the instigation of, again, some of his officials, what does Daniel do?
He went and prayed.
He goes, he opens the window and prays, just inviting people to see it. Daniel is not going to. Esther, on the other hand, counsel to be quiet. Daniel has more power, perhaps. Daniel has more agency. Daniel has more ability to influence circumstances on his own, perhaps, than Esther does. Maybe that's part of it. But I think we're supposed to wrestle with this. Should Esther have gone into this contest as though she had a choice? But should she have? Should she be sleeping with a Gentile king? Should this have happened? And so people struggle with this. Should she be eating from the king's table? That's just sort of a mention that comes up at some point in her story. She received a portion of food from the king's table. Well, that's a problem. Remember what Daniel did? Daniel said, no, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to eat that. So it's almost a direct contrast between the way Daniel deals with being a Jew in a foreign land and the way Esther deals with it.
Well, let's be real here. Had she refused, what would have happened to Esther, and then what would have happened to God's plan?
Well, and that's I think where the struggle comes in, right? Because in all of this, God does something. And I don't want to get too far ahead, but God does something, right? Colette, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think a little bit differently about it, that God will always come up with an option when we even go astray. Because I see Mordecai just as bad as the king and those men. I mean, he's just as violating of Queen Esther or Esther as the other guys, and violating her and abusive and oppressive. And she's a pawn, just like a concubine. And I don't think that was God's will, but God will work in spite of that for the Jewish people. But I'm like, Mordecai, come on. Stand up for your needs.
And the motives are left unsaid, right? Does Mordecai have a choice of her entering this thing or not? Is this even, as Mom pointed out, is this a choice? And then, okay, if that's the case, then, isn't persecution and death better than some things? But again, as Christy said, we weren't there. We don't know. But this is the story. This is the way. This is what we're told, and I think we're supposed to have these questions. I think we're supposed to have these struggles, because it's not clean. It's not neat. It's not the righteous person wins out. The person who sticks to their guns and sticks to their principles wins out. It doesn't seem that that's the case right off the bat. That seems to work out a little.
Patrick, I have another thought here too. When you were talking about the king, I see also Mordecai in this light. When people with power tend to be very insecure, and so their power goes before them. And if that's the case, I see Mordecai having power over Esther, and his actions are that of an insecure person, because I'm afraid we're going to get caught. It's going to wipe out the people or whatever. I don't want to get ahead of the story, but it seems like when you have all this power, and I forget what Christy called them, but yeah, they're not very smart people, or they seem cowardice. It's an insecurity there, because their faith is not where it should be. Because when you're oppressing other people, it has to come from a place it has to come from a place of power that kind of marries insecurity, and not from a place of love where we include and build up. And so it just seems that that's what Mordecai is doing as well. It's not this, you got all this power, but you're not using it right. Because we know with power, you should be humble, because you don't have to prove your point.
And I don't know how much power Mordecai has at the beginning.
Over Esther, I mean, that's what I mean.
Esther, yes, over Esther, yes.
Yes.
Yes, I don't know how much power or influence, I don't think he has much at the
No.
beginning. He's at the king's gate, but that can just mean he's one of the many people hanging out at the king's gate waiting to get their cases heard. But you're right, he does have this, and the other thing, the thing that makes me want to resist a little bit criticism of Mordecai is verse 11 of chapter 2. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and you're not wrong. I do think he cares about her. I do think he's concerned about her. I do think he wants what's best for her, and perhaps he's wrongheaded. I do think he cares about her interest. He cares about what's going on with her. He cares about how she's getting on.
But perhaps he's walking back and forth to see if she's chosen. It doesn't have to be because he cares for her, but just a little humor there. But I hear you, and I accept that from you as well.
Everyday life can't have been that great for the Jews either.
Yeah.
This treatment at the hands of the king, as manipulative as it was, may have been preferable to the circumstances she was in before.
Well, that's true.
It's fairly likely. That's why people were vying for this.
I mean, that's true. You know, that's certainly possible. Matt pointed out that perhaps things are so bad for Jews and for Esther and Mordecai in particular that whatever happens with this crazy contest is better than what she would otherwise be experiencing. I don't know. I don't know. If that's the case, man, it's ugly that those were her choices, right?
But it does give, if that's the case, it does give context to why Esther goes along with everything, why Mordecai goes along with everything to the extent that they do. That doesn't excuse Xerxes' actions, of course, but it could give some context to Esther's. And perhaps he wasn't as observant as a Jew as she might have wanted to be.
Right.
Well, I don't think there could have been I mean, it couldn't have been completely horrible if no one knew they were Jews.
Right.
I mean, if they can keep that secret, then it must have been a version of anti-Jewishness, but not as we might think. Otherwise people would know she was a Jew, right?
Right.
Well, Haman knows Mordecai is a Jew.
He does know
And
Mordecai.
no one in court knows Esther is a Jew, but that doesn't necessarily preclude that they weren't on the ends of anti-Semitism previously.
Yeah. Did everybody hear that? Yeah. So, okay. So,
In that way, it reminds me of Daniel some. I mean, the king doesn't seem to have known of his religious practices, or he probably wouldn't have passed the law the way that he did. Daniel didn't go out of his way to advertise that he was a follower of God, but he didn't stop his practices either. People knew about it.
Yeah.
The people that urged the king to pass the law knew about it, but and there's a lot he could have gone to the king and protested that he didn't. There's perhaps more that Esther could have done, but she didn't. You know, when you're in a regime that's inherently corrupt, like all of our regimes are, there's compromise you have to make from the ideal.
yeah. And how much influence can Esther have? How much influence can Mordecai have? All of these questions are the questions I think that this book is supposed to sort of make us consider, make us think about.
There's so much gray area between the ideal theocracy and the direct conflict with your faith, where you have to draw the line and be willing to die for it. It's like, where do we fall between those extremes? A lot of the time that we have to wrestle.
Right. So as we go through chapter 2, then at the end of chapter 2, there's a sort of a detour from Esther's story for a moment. And this is the first of a lot of coincidences, circumstances that come about in this story. And this happens during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. He's trying to find out what's going on. He's wanting to know what's happening. and he overhears two of the guards conspiring to assassinate Xerxes. Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. I mean, one might say, Mordecai, why did you report it? Why didn't you just let circumstances play out? I don't know. Mordecai feels though the need to report what's happened, and in doing so, gets sort of a gold star by his name, and that becomes important later on. And he wouldn't have been able, perhaps, to get word to the king as he did if Esther wasn't where she was. So the two officials are impaled. There's lots of impaling on poles, Esther, just so you know. I think the King James translates that gallows. It's not the kind of hanging that we're thinking about, probably. It's generally, often it was done after death, but it was a way of displaying a body by literally sticking it on a sharp pole and setting it up outside the gate. So again, this is not pretty. But there's a whole lot of impaling on poles going on in Esther. Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. Matt says we know what this is from Game of Thrones. Yes, if you watch Game of Thrones, perhaps you've seen that or read the books. So after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. So just so you know which Hammedatha we're talking about, it's the one that was the Agagite. Just so you're aware.
It doesn't say for what.
It does not say for what. Agagite, by the way, probably means Haman is a descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites, who Saul, the other son of Benjamin, or the other Benjamite who was the son of Kish, spared when God told him to slaughter all the Agagites. Yeah, so yeah, there's not supposed to be any, and the Amalekites, and so this is sort of this is another sort of interesting little thing about a little subplot in Esther. We have a Benjamite who's the son of Kish versus an Amalekite who's the son of Agag. It's sort of a I don't know, rematch.
Perhaps the narrative is telling us this is the consequence of Saul disobeying God, that this descendant of Agag is around to cause trouble for the Jews.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think if Saul had done what he was supposed to do all those years ago, we wouldn't have Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and we wouldn't have these circumstances. Interesting thing. So on Purim, which is the holiday that we'll talk about based on Esther, in the synagogues, the story of Esther is read. And as the story is read, whenever Haman's name is mentioned, all the kids in the synagogue make noise to drown out Haman's name. So
It's next week.
yeah, it is. Purim is next week, which is kind of one of the reasons I wanted to do it this time of year. And yes, that's got to be so much fun for little kids, to get to. You mean we get to make noise in the synagogue?
They also dress up in costumes.
yeah.
It's the Rocky Horror Esther show.
It's sort of it's participation like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So all the royal officials at the king's gate kneel down, pay honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. We're not told why. It was not necessarily a religious objection for a Jewish person to kneel before someone of a higher social rank, like a person the king had designated to honor. So it's probably not a religious refusal. It's probably has to do with who this guy is, or heritage or whatever. But in any case, Mordecai won't do it.
I think it had to do with power.
Power perhaps, right.
Haman wanted total power over all the people, and Mordecai was not gonna bow to that power.
So they tell Haman about it, and Haman is enraged. Verse 5. Here's another person in power who gets his feelings hurt, right, and has a tantrum. And Mordecai's tantrum is, it's not enough just to have. Or Haman's tantrum is, it's not enough just to have Mordecai killed. I want to wipe out all of his people, or wipe out everybody, which let you know something about Haman and his state of mind. And so in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select the day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So just so you know, Haman is probably asking for, some sort of spiritual guidance as to when the most auspicious day to wipe out the Jewish people would be. And they cast the lot, which is some sort of gaming piece. And the lot falls on the 12th month. So we have almost a full year before this is going to happen. And that becomes pretty significant as well. I mean, what if it had fallen on the first month next week? Things get a little tighter at that point, right? Haman goes to the king, and this is, the interesting thing to me. Haman said to the king, there's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. You heard that, right? Their customs are different. They keep themselves separate. They're not us. That's the way it always works, right? That's the way racism and intolerance and hatred and genocide, it's the way it always happens, right? They're different from us. They're not us, and it's not in our best interest to tolerate. And that's exactly where Haman is. That's exactly what his mindset is. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I'll give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators. 10,000 talents. There was a Greek historian, Herodotus, who said that that 10,000 talents. He talked about the annual income of the whole Persian kingdom, and 10,000 talents was about 2/3 of it. It's a massive amount of money, massive amount of wealth that Haman is promising to give. I assume. How do you think Haman's going to get this kind of money?
From destroying the Jews.
From wiping out the Jews, right? When I kill all the Jews, I'll take their stuff and I'll give it to the king. Boom. Problem solved. Verse 12, then the royal secretaries are summoned, and wrote out the script of each province and the language of each people, all Haman's orders to the officials, the regional officials. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods.
And just, in verse 10 and 11, just the attitude of the king, he doesn't even ask who the people are that Haman is talking about. And then he says, oh, keep the money, I don't even want it.
Whatever you like, yeah, whatever you like.
And do with them as you please. He has no idea who these people are, what they contribute to society in his kingdom. Oh, no, do what you want with them.
This,
It's just
Arrogance.
talking about this,
so callous.
when we see what's happening in the news in Ukraine, and you see it never changes, right? This kind of stuff doesn't change. The chilling thing to me is verse 15. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered, in an uproar. Is probably a better way to describe it. So they're sitting down and having a drink while the city is just coming apart at the seams around. Well, Mordecai learns about this, chapter 4, verse 1. I want to get to this one, get through part of this, and then we'll stop for the night. Mordecai learns of all this, puts on this Jewish display of not just Jewish, this display of mourning, tearing his clothes, sackcloth, smearing ashes on him, wails in the city loudly and bitterly, only as far as the king's gate, because you can't go in sackcloth. King doesn't want unhappy people around him, I guess. In that way. Yeah, right. So great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther's attendance here, what Mordecai is doing, and it seems like Esther's almost kind of embarrassed about the whole thing at first. She's like sending him clothes to put on. Stop it, Mordecai. Don't draw attention to yourself. Finally, one of the attendants goes out to Mordecai, and Mordecai tells him what's happened, gave him a copy of the edict, and to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence and to beg for mercy and plead with her people. Esther's response is, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king and the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law: they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. And Mordecai, then, probably the most famous part of the book of Esther, in verse 13, sends back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther is reluctant, right? And you could argue, well, come on, there's some things you could do, Esther. Maybe you could just send a message to the king. Maybe you could ask for permission to enter. There's things you could do. I kind of wonder, reading this again, does Esther maybe think that all she has to offer is that she's pretty? I mean, that's the way she's been treated so far, right? That's what she's been told. She has to have been a young woman, a very young woman, maybe not much more than a girl when all this happened to her. Maybe it's just that she doesn't think she's got much else to offer.
Real quick, Mom says 4:14 is always been a favorite of hers. For such a time as this, God is always in control, and He puts us in a position every day to do His work.
God is always in control and puts us into a position every day to do His work. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the famous lines in the book.
Patrick,
Yes.
I think you're right that she probably thought that's all she had to give because that's how she's been thrust on. That's the worldview of women. But it tells us more about her faith. The next paragraph, right? She says, "Let's fast and pray." But probably her perception of self and what she could do without power versus the men with power. I have no power. What are you coming to me for? But hearing what Mordecai says, she calls on something greater, her faith. But her worldview, how she perceived herself, you're probably exactly right.
I mean,
Why are you calling on me?
much different, right? I mean, So anyway, so yeah, she does, as you say, Esther verse 15. Then and 16, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So she does. She digs down at some point and says, all right, you're right. And maybe I'm here for just this reason. And I don't know if she even believes it, but she, but she's willing to give it a try, right? She says finally, all right, if this is the last thing I do on earth, that's worth it. And she, asks for prayer. This, by the way, is as religious as Esther, the book of Esther gets. Pray for me, fast for me. And Mordecai's statement, deliverance will arise from another place. It's almost like the book is going out of its way to not mention God. I mean, that would be some obvious places, right? But I think we're supposed to see the way life can sometimes catch you by surprise, and you don't know what God's doing, and you can't see it, and you don't know what His plan is, and you don't know how you fit into it. And Esther hears from Mordecai and gathers the community around her, and they pray and fast, and she says, all right, I'll do it. And if I die.
And of course, it could have gone the other way.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason we're celebrating this story is because when she went before the king, for whatever reason, he was in a good mood, he'd had a good meal, he thought she was beautiful, or God took a guiding hand in it. The story ended, I mean, things happened the way they did, but we also have other stories where people who stood up for God's way or the right way don't make it through the story. And I think she really believed that she might die. And I think we don't know. I have heard people say about various things, well, God clearly did that. I think God clearly can do that, but we're not puppets. And I don't know for sure if this was God driving the king to do it. If so, okay. And other things not, you get into a dangerous place if we attribute all the good things that happened to God's hand. No, it wasn't the king doing it. You know what I mean? I'm getting a little flustered with it, but I don't think God runs the world as a puppeteer. Right. And sometimes we want to say when something good happens, well, that was God running it, and He can, but I don't think it's a framework that works if we say it has to be the way it was.
Because as you say, it's hard to develop any kind of a rule or a pattern about that, right? I mean, good people all the time stand up for what's right and get their legs cut out from under them when they do. And I mean, that happens as well. And that could have happened to Esther. And in fact, I think Esther probably absolutely expected that's what would happen. And she does it anyway. It reminds me again of Daniel and his friends, right? The three friends get thrown in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they say, what's their response? God is able to save us. And even if He does not, we won't bow down to your idols. This is something akin to the same spirit and the same conviction.
Well, and even if He does not, that's our answer.
Yeah.
Right? It's our moral principles can be defined by whether God's going to save us or not.
Right.
There's right and there's wrong. There's good and there's evil in the world.
Right.
And it's on us to stand up and like Esther to use what influence and what power we do have to help people.
That's right. Well, we need to wind up for tonight. Thank you so much for your comments. For next week, we will finish up the story of Esther. I know you're all just waiting, wondering how it's going to end, but we'll try to preserve suspense and finish up the story next week and talk about some kind of interesting things that are mentioned about Esther, especially toward the end of the book, that I think are worth noting.